Should we switch gears and go over to Intel? That was pretty massive news that I think shocked a lot of people, and maybe it shouldn't have. But anytime you hear about the government taking a 9.9% stake in any company, that's a pretty strong signal. One, as to what they're viewing as important nationally over the long term, right? You're not going to drive this on just any company. I think the fact that it was Intel makes a lot of sense. But they essentially got 9.9% using the funding that was already out there from the Chips and Science Act. And then I think the other part was the Secure Enclave, that national security initiative made up the other 3.2 billion. But then on top of it, and I haven't really heard this talked about a whole lot, is they've got 5-year warrants to go up to 13.3, which likely means more funding available for these chip manufacturers. What do you guys make out of this move? It's a pretty massive shift up in the markets.
I think we should let our think tank expert Ovik go first.
Well, I'll recommend another book for people who are interested in this topic. It's called Chip Wars, and it really talks a lot about how the modern high-end semiconductor market came to be, with a big emphasis on Intel and TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. And I think one of the lessons from that book that's relevant to this topic is that you can't subsidize your way to chip dominance. China has been trying to do this for a long time. You don't think China isn't jealous of TSMC, doesn't want to outperform TSMC? They have spent probably about $250 billion subsidizing their domestic advanced semiconductor industry to no avail. Because what TSMC has achieved, the amount of engineering sophistication in not just TSMC's processes itself, but the whole supply chain of equipment and raw materials that goes into building these advanced semiconductors, like the ones that mine Bitcoin, is incredibly, incredibly complex and requires incredible talent and sophistication. And so the idea that you're going to throw a lot of money at a domestic manufacturer, in the case of Intel, and you're going to catch up, I'm extremely skeptical that that's going to work, especially when you think about what the Biden era mandates that the CHIPS Act will put on these companies. You have to have daycare for the workers and all these things around DEI stuff that they layered in on there. And some of that may roll back under Trump because he's ideologically in a different place, but still, I wouldn't be shocked if the U.S. government doesn't lose money on its Intel investment here.
I want to pop up another Bloomberg screen here because this is a screen that I've been following very closely for years. So we have a semiconductor ETF that one of our theses was, semiconductors being the new oil in this new world. And look at the difference in total return between TSMC and Intel over the last 5 years. Intel is actually down in total return, 44%. In an environment where semiconductors are the new oil, there was one clear winner here in this race, and it was TSMC being able to produce these most advanced chips. And so, I think that is a really smart observation, Ovik, that it is not guaranteed at all, probably unlikely, that Intel is a true competitor in this landscape and be able to produce these chips, as much as we would want that to not be the case. And Intel themselves has had a pretty bad history of leaning pretty hard in some of this ESG and DEI stuff outside of even Biden forcing it on them. And you have to think that this has been covered pretty well over the last couple of years, that maybe they've lost the plot a little bit from where they should have been focused, or maybe they had already lost it and they knew they had lost it, so they were trying to put window dressing on in the form of ESG to make it look prettier than it might otherwise be. But with regards to the U.S. taking a stake, I think an important framework to think about here is, did the U.S. force the stake on Intel, or did Intel actually want the stake? And I think Intel desperately wanted the stake. I mean, you look at that graph, this is a struggling company that's not been competitive in a very important industry that had all these different grants, kind of government handouts that had been promised under previous administrations that really wanted to collect on them. They needed this. And we can get into should the government own stakes of companies? And I generally don't think that they should, but this was not like a situation in China where you might see where the government just comes in and takes over a company. I think this was the company desperately wanting help in any way, shape, or form, and that this was strategic for Intel. And then when you look at some of the governance rights associated with this, like this increased the power of the Intel executive company in a major way versus their state of before the U.S. government's actions. So I think this was strategic for Intel and for the United States. I mean, I'm not a fan of the U.S. taking positions, but if the U.S. is going to cut a $10 billion check as a taxpayer, I'd rather have an ownership position than just give a present away for nothing or nothing except for mandates, DEI mandates, or the previous administration. So I guess like where I come out of is like, I wish the government wasn't cutting checks. I think this has a high probability of not being successful, but I prefer it to just giving away money for nothing.
Well, to your point on the power aspect there, Matt, I believe that their setup is that they're passive, right? And so they vote along with the board. And I think that's what you mean by the ownership rights there. The other thing that was in there was, along with those 5-year warrants, it's effectively an anti-outsourcing clause, right? They're making them hold the foundries domestically 51%. So 51% of the foundry or the manufacturing on those chips needs to be domestically owned within the United States. So it's clear that they're pushing it that direction, with that clause, because they're putting that trigger in saying, if you fall below the 51%, we're taking an additional stake up to 13.3%, I believe, ownership in the company.
Exactly. And so how these investor rights work, if Intel didn't like that, they were within their rights to go raise $10 billion from someone else without those clauses. And the reality is that there was not $10 billion at that price without clauses that were more attractive to Intel, and so they took that deal. And I just think that framework is so important to come back to, that this wasn't, in my view, maybe I'm wrong, but from everything I can read, this was not some forced nationalization. And so I think when you frame it that way, the risks of further action by the US government, like taking over MicroStrategy or something like that to get a bunch of Bitcoin, I don't think this increases the probability of a forced action like that. Could the US under this administration of a bunch of business guys that are, pumped to make deals, try to make deals? Maybe, yeah. But deals are different than we are taking this company.
And the other piece of it too is that, and by the way, Trump has claimed that in fact Intel was very happy to get this take. He said I can't remember if it was a press conference or he was somewhere, but he was quoted by reporters as saying, "Yeah, I proposed that we should take a 10% stake in Intel when I met with the CEO," and the CEO was like, "Yeah, sure, we would love that." So that's at least Trump's recounting of the conversation he had with the Intel CEO, and I would guess that a big part of it too is that Intel is thinking that they're the new Fannie and Freddie, right? Like, this makes us too big to fail. If the government takes a stake in us, then the government also has a stake in our success and will bend the regulatory landscape in our favor. And that's the part of this that's probably the most insidious, because in a true market where you want other companies to rise, hopefully American companies to rise and be able to compete with Intel, maybe Intel sees this as their way of getting a leg up.
Yeah, entirely possible. The noise did flow over into the Bitcoin space pretty quickly, and you already touched on this just briefly, Matt, but it always raises those questions, right, where people have been looking for what's going to be the angle of the government to obtain stakes in Bitcoin. And does this raise any concerns for a company like a Strategy that's out there holding significant amount of Bitcoin? And I think one of the first things you have to look at is, well, what was the driver behind this, right? The driver was the incentive. It was the capital that was required for a company like Intel to have a desire to take this stake. So when you look at a company like MicroStrategy, the first question you have to ask is, what can the government offer them that they need for their strategy? If that was going to be a question. But broadly, I think no. I don't see this flowing over into the Bitcoin treasury companies, but it's an interesting thought experiment to go through, because we haven't really seen this in the US before. And so this does raise new questions going, how prevalent is this going to become? How much wheeling and dealing are corporations going to be willing to do in order to get funding out of the government to build their businesses? Is this something that's going to have a huge amount of appetite and demand for it? Or was this a strategic one-off for something that's viewed as nationally strategic as, chips? What do you guys think?
I think in the near term, you're right that it's not something that's a near-term risk or possibility for Bitcoin. But imagine a world in which these Bitcoin-backed fixed income instruments have ratings from rating agencies, A, AA, B, whatever it is. The central banks have shown, both in crises and non-crisis periods, that they're willing to buy corporate debt that is reasonably rated. They generally don't go so far as to buy unrated fixed income securities. At least that's historically not what they've done. But they have waded into corporate debt in the past where they feel like the collateralization is reasonably high. So if we move into a world in which the bond rating agencies do start rating these Bitcoin-backed instruments, does that then basically qualify them for being held by central banks? I'm interested in Matt's take on that.
Yeah, I first want to actually talk about, just what the position I think the U.S. is in with regards to Bitcoin, even though we have a Bitcoin strategic reserve, but it's pretty small. Some of that Bitcoin might be actually owed to people that it was illegally seized from. And so what the actual position of the Bitcoin is that's truly long-term in the United States hands is probably pretty small. But there was a report earlier this year by River, actually, that about 40% of all Bitcoin are held in the United States today. And so when you think about what that means is that the United States is Bitcoin rich because its citizens are Bitcoin rich versus any other country in the world. And obviously strategy from a corporate perspective, there's never going to be a company that owns more Bitcoin, in my view, than strategy. Now we'll play for number two, but strategy, has a ton of Bitcoin. And I think the more likely scenario is that other international corporations are much more likely to have their Bitcoin seized by a government. Why? Because the people in those countries own less Bitcoin. As much as, I am a US dollar bear that I think the DXY goes down, the United States still has the global reserve currency and we have better governance. I think we are one of the least likely nations in the world to actually have to seize Bitcoin because we already have the Bitcoin held through our citizens and our corporations. And that puts us in a strategically strong position to just through deregulation make the United States the Bitcoin capital of the world. So I think that is the position that we are in as a nation. If there was some crisis scenario that the dollar just completely collapsed, I think you could throw all that out the window in a true crisis. But I don't think that we are there. I don't think that we have to be there for Bitcoin to go into the millions of dollar range and just play the devaluation trade, the Bitcoin going up to gold parity trade. I think all of those, and then even Bitcoin being considered money, an option for money, or the dollar is an option for money, Bitcoin's an option for money, gold's an option for money, silver's an option for money, and just kind of to pull on that string just a little bit, so it's super interesting. Gold and silver are actually legal tender in a handful of states already today. Texas announced a law this year to make gold and silver legal tender. And there's an interesting book called Pirate Money that calls out a specific clause in the U.S. Constitution where states are constitutionally allowed to make gold and silver legal tender to be competitive with the U.S. dollar as an option, as an opt-out for federalism to give power back to the states. Maybe Bitcoin is actually added to that in the future. I think that there would be a strong reason to think that it might, and that states might actually challenge to make that happen. And I think all of those things for the United States are a much better path to go down than seizing Bitcoin from a corporation. But we will, I guess we'll have to see how the future plays out.